Guten Tag, liebe Livestream-Schauende. Heute funktioniert der Livestream zum Glück und wenn Sie jetzt im Panopto-Recorder schauen, können Sie unten rechts auf einen kleinen Pfeil in Panopto anzeigen drücken. Dann sehen Sie den Redner und die PowerPoint gleichzeitig. Das nur als Tipp für den nächsten Vortrag. Viel Spaß!
Ja, einen herzlichen Dank an Herrn Zembrowski, Viktor Wolker von unserem eigenen englischen Seminar und das gerade war Damaris Stein, die auch als Administratorin dieser Ringvorlesung hier dafür sorgt, dass der technische Bereich funktioniert. Letztes Mal war es wirklich nicht unsere Schuld, dass es nicht funktioniert hat und diese Woche hören wir geht's. Das ist auch wichtig, denn wir haben einen illustren Gast. Now I switch to English. Mark Ferguson is a wonderful father and husband, a great friend, and a professor. Yeah, and the professor where he has been from 2003, Wofford College, that's Spartanburg, South Carolina. As it says on wherever that screen now is, either there, or for those who are actually in the room behind us, of course. Mark is one of the leading specialists in drama, and not only American drama, but actually world drama. He has an MA in dramatic literature and a PhD in comparative literature and drama from Washington University in St. Louis, where he also taught in the departments of English and performing arts. He's done other jobs before, arts, academia, advertising, financial services, a stint as a welder, but his most important work, obviously, is in the field of drama. His dissertation was on landscape politics and alienation in the work of Heiner Müller and Richard Foreman, and these are two of his favorite dramatists to this day. We got to know each other when he was a foreign language assistant at the University of Stuttgart in the late 90s, where he also started the English-speaking University of Stuttgart theater project. He starts theater projects wherever he goes. We have one already, the Maniacs here, but he joined us this year after having been here before in 2012 on a Fulbright sabbatical. He joined us this year in order to help us set up a master in theater studies. I hope that by the end of the academic year we might have that, but then with Corona and everything, who knows? He has also directed a lot of drama at the department in Spartanburg at Wofford College, of which he is the director. What was that? And he does Shakespeare just as well as he does authors who are almost unknown here, like Sarah Ruhl, or something like a musical mashup like Into the Woods. So today's subject is a bit out of his way, unless you understand, as he does, theater as a discipline and one of the most important tools in our critical arsenal. Much like the study of philosophy, psychology, religion, and history, the serious study of theater can be enormously powerful as we attempt to understand the puzzles of our own culture and the nature and purpose of human existence. I quote him here. So today, I think part of what he will be talking about is the performances of the presidential office and the performance of politics as it happens in the fall of the year of our Lord 2020, just before the elections, possibly the most important elections in the past 150 years, ever since that disaster in 1860. Thank you, and welcome to Dr. Professor Mark Ferguson.
Professor Hochbruch, vielen, vielen Dank für Ihre nette Rede. Es ist wirklich nett von dir. Ich freue mich hier mit Ihnen heute Abend zu sein. I'm also going to speak English all night. I want to say that it is true that I am a theater artist. I'm a director, a theater scholar. Tonight, I am talking about, at Herr Professor Dr. Hochbruch's behest, the 2020 presidential election from the perspective of South Carolina. To be honest and truthful, it's really just the perspective of one South Carolinian, and that's me, right? And just so that we are clear, I am not a political scientist. I am not a professor of government. I am not an investigative journalist. I am not even a conspiracy theorist, although everybody is a part-time conspiracy theorist these days. So those are some things that I am and some things that I am not. I told Wolfgang that I was struggling a little bit with this talk tonight in the same way that many of us are struggling generally with 2020 because it's a mess. And the situation in the U.S. is very complicated and unfortunate in a lot of ways. But tonight I'll try and shed a little bit of light on that for you guys here and for ladies and gentlemen in TV land. Generally, this is the situation in the U.S. Biden is up in the polls with a commanding lead. There are three things I want to suggest that account for Biden's popularity and rising poll numbers, plus 9.9 over the incumbent as of this writing. 1, a deadly pandemic. 2, an intense and long overdue national conversation about race. And 3, his general likability, especially as opposed to Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. Pamela Carlin's article from the October 8th edition of the New York Review of Books is titled Our Most Vulnerable Election. This is a thing that Professor Hochbruch intimated as well. Now, it might be true even if this election were only about the issues. They include how will America handle COVID-19 moving forward, racial inequality, immigration, climate change, foreign relations, economic policy, and judicial appointments, all of which depend on whom we choose to lead us next in the United States. But in fact, the situation is much more serious than that. The current president has sought to undermine the legitimacy of the election for months, alleging without proof widespread voter fraud, exacerbated by the increase in mail-in voting due to the coronavirus. He has also signaled repeatedly that he will not accept unfavorable results as legitimate, which is problematic. So basically, he's saying, if I win, I will accept the results. This sets the stage for an election situation in which the very best we might be able to hope for is global humiliation as the ballot count drags on for days and weeks in the midst of a nonstop shouting contest. If that's the best case scenario, other potentially very real alternatives that a contested election result might lead to include civil unrest, violence, localized or widespread or worse. Writing in the Washington Post this past September 11th, Rachel Kleinfeld put it this way: the United States is now among the world's most polarized countries. Racial, ideological, religious, and geographic identities reinforce one another, exacerbating partisan divisions rather than offering alternative connections. Trust in the government is at a near historic low of 17%, and 79% of Americans think that there's too little trust between citizens. Meanwhile, institutional guardrails are disintegrating. Gridlock and decline define Congress. Opinions about the Supreme Court are increasingly driven by partisanship. And the Republican Party has set aside professed values to rally behind a personality. The title of her article, one of the more chilling assessments of the situation as I read it, is "The U.S. shows all the signs of a country spiraling towards political violence." So, once again, welcome to my talk this evening. It's going to be pure pleasure. All right. So this was supposed to be a slide. There was an issue with the size of my presentation because I had all these super cool images, and it ballooned my and beyond all reason. But anyway, this is the graphic for this next slide. It's a dog drinking a cup of coffee in a burning room with the caption, "It's fine. It's fine. Don't worry." And in fact, thank you for reminding me, the PowerPoint is going to be uploaded to Ilias, so es gibt schon im Internet zu bestaunen. All right, we'll get back to this. All right, for the duration of our time together this evening, I propose we set aside any creeping dread we might be feeling and take a look at some of the factors in both the national and South Carolina political contests. I'll share some historical background about South Carolina, try to shed some light on what is happening in the Republican portion of the electorate, try and make it clear a little bit, and also try to give a sense of what we might be able to expect from these elections, at least up until November 3rd, at which point all bets are off. Now, let us shift our focus to South Carolina. Here, I've got a great graphic of the United States with South Carolina illuminated. That's what you're secretly looking at. Okay. South Carolina was one of the original 13 colonies. From the beginning, its roots were strongly agrarian. A mild, in some places almost subtropical climate, plenty of rain, fertile soil, made it a great place to grow cotton, rice, and indigo, both for the people who lived on it before the Europeans arrived and subsequent plantation owners. Many landowners were loyal to England, in part because so many of the original plantations were land grants from the throne. While it was nominally democratic, from 1790 until 1865, almost 100 years, wealthy landowners were in exclusive control of the government in South Carolina. For example, a man, and it was just a man, was not eligible to sit in the State House of Representatives unless he possessed an estate of 500 acres of land and at least 10 enslaved Africans, or at least 150 pounds of sterling. This may seem crazy, undemocratic, elitist, it certainly is, but keep in mind that the current setup of the Electoral College, which is the way that presidents are still chosen in the U.S., and which, by the way, has awarded the presidency to a candidate that did not win the popular vote in 2 of the last 5 elections, is actually set up in exactly the same way. Not exactly the same way. You don't have to own slaves to be in the Electoral College. But it was set up for the same reasons, right? That is, we don't trust the hoi polloi and John Q. Public in a direct democracy. We need to have electors. We need to have people who go and cast the votes on behalf of the citizens of the country. Now, back to the history. Dissatisfaction in South Carolina with the federal government grew almost from the beginning of the Union. In the 1820s, John C. Calhoun became a leading proponent of states' rights, limited government, all the way up to the nullification of the U.S. Constitution and free trade. Many issues which, interestingly, still have traction in the state today. In 1832, this is just an example, the Ordinance of Nullification declared federal tariff laws unconstitutional, leading to the so-called nullification crisis. Sounds serious. The Federal Force Bill was enacted to use whatever military force necessary to bring South Carolina back into line. I point this detail out as a data point to show that South Carolina's resistance to federal oversight goes back almost all the way to the beginning of its history. Some of you, however, might be more familiar with what happened some 30 years later in 1860. Here is another delightful graphic that you will have to check out later. In the U.S. presidential election of 1860, voting was sharply divided. The South voted for the Southern Democrats, and the North for Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party. Lincoln, as we know, was anti-slavery, did not acknowledge the right to succession, and would not yield federal property in Southern states. Southern secessionists believed Lincoln's election meant long-term doom for their slavery-based agrarian economy and social system, and for good reason. This is actually Professor Hochbrook's area of expertise, in part. Lincoln was elected president on November 6, 1860. The State House of Representatives 3 days later passed the resolution to call the election of Abraham Lincoln as U.S. president a hostile act. And within weeks, South Carolina became the first state to secede. The Civil War broke out 5 months later in April 1861 when secessionist forces attacked Fort Sumter, a Union Army base on a small island in Charleston Harbor. This was shortly after Abraham Lincoln had been inaugurated as president. This slide is delightful. It is the South Carolina presidential election results from 1952 to 2016. And what it shows is, this is just 52 to 2016, if you're following along at home. But from the very beginning, South Carolina has been super polarized. And really, the graphic itself is not that important. I'll just tell you what it says, right? What it says is that in every election, essentially, until 1964, South Carolina voted to send the Democratic candidate to Washington to serve as president. Anyone that wants to know why the South has been so reliably Republican all these years need only look to 1964. In the 1964 election, the Republicans created and deployed the so-called Southern strategy. This was an electoral strategy to increase political support among white voters in the South by appealing, frankly, to racism and racists. As the civil rights movement and the dismantling of Jim Crow segregation laws in the 50s and 60s had visibly deepened existing racial tensions in much of the southern U.S., Republican operatives and candidates like Richard Nixon and Senator Barry Goldwater developed strategies that contributed to the political political realignment of many white conservative voters in the South. They had traditionally supported the Democrats. Now they were given a choice. And it was suggested in lots of coded and some not so coded ways that Republican was the way to vote now. Notably, Senator Strom Thurmond changed parties that year, 1964. This also helped push the Republican Party much further to the right. It has also made it subsequently almost impossible for Republicans to recruit African-American voters back into their ranks. African-American voters are certainly not a monolith, but the usual question is to what extent does a candidate motivate African-American turnout? Not which party they will cast their vote for. For example, African American voters were overwhelmingly present and a factor in Barack Obama's election and re-election, much less a factor, obviously, in 2016. It seems clear, to return briefly to the president, that Kamala Harris was chosen to energize that portion of the electorate, although she is also, as you know, not uncomplicated. Her history as a prosecutor with a reputation as someone tough on crime makes her a polarizing as much as a potentially energizing figure. Did this one make it? That one made it. Okay, great. So I'm including this slide for a couple of reasons. It's glorious, right? And I get something to look at, besides me. I'm including this slide here for a couple of reasons. The first one is it helps explain why the South generally, and South Carolina in particular, was so keen on James Madison's 3/5 compromise. It allowed the vast number of enslaved black people to be at least partially included in the population calculations for representation in the House of Representatives. The other noteworthy thing on this slide is the dramatic drop in the percentage of African Americans starting shortly after the turn of the century. That, of course, is a result of the Great Migration, the huge shift of black populations away from the South, often to the North or Midwest, for many reasons, but one of the significant ones is to escape from the Jim Crow era South. The bottom line and the final result where we land is that the population of South Carolina today is roughly 70% white or identifying as white, 25% black, and 5% other, so Asian, Latino, Pacific Islander, Native American, and so on. But crucially, for our purposes tonight, 70% white, 70% identifying as white. At this point, I'd like to pivot to a conversation about the Republican Party in South Carolina. My guess is that some of you, if not all of you, are struggling to understand how there could be so many people left that support Donald Trump for re-election after these past 4 years. I want to give a disclaimer here and say that, there are exceptions to every rule. These are things that I have seen. The Republican Party is a coalition of white Christians and other white Christians. It's all kinds of white Christians. The Republican Party is not a monolith. It's a rather sometimes quite a loose coalition of evangelical Christians, often one-issue voters. They're anti-abortion. Sometimes they're anti-gay marriage. There are security voters. These are defense hawks or military watchers who want the U.S. more or less entangled in foreign wars. There are sub-rosa racists, or formerly sub-rosa racists. I'll talk about that in a second. It's suddenly okay to be a racist publicly. It seems weird, but that seems to be one of the things that's happening. Sub-rosa racists and anti-immigrant people who couch their interests in terms of fairness and good jobs for Americans. But really, when you look at it closely, they are plugging into the blood and soil tropes that are reminiscent of the National Socialists in Germany in the 20s and 30s and 40s. The anti-immigrant people were awakened and brought into the fold by Trump's initial descent down that escalator in 2015 when he called Mexicans a bunch of thugs and rapists. Nobody could believe it. Everybody knew there's no way that this goofball was getting reelected or getting elected in the first place. We were wrong, right? We underestimated people's rage, people's fear, blood and soil. You can add to these the pro-business voters. And sometimes fiscal conservatives, occasionally they're known as country club Republicans. That is, they might be quite cosmopolitan and progressive privately, right? For example, they might have nothing against gay marriage, as long as it's not their kid that's gay. But more often, country club Republican functions as code for rich white people who don't want to pay so much in taxes. That's basically it, right? I work hard for my money. I shouldn't have to be supporting those welfare moms who should go out there and get a job. They're clearly people who fit into these groups that are not white and Christian, but I would argue that they are a smaller percentage, and in fact the exception that prove the rule. This white and Christian coalition is key to understanding the Republican Party, at least in South Carolina. Christians? Seems weird. Trump has obviously behaved in ways that even the most liberal Christian commentators would have a hard time defending as faithful to either the letter or the spirit of the teachings of Jesus Christ. But for people who hope to see Roe versus Wade overturned, gay marriage made illegal, or transgender citizens forced to use the bathrooms noted on their birth certificates, all through the appointing of conservative judges and justices, his personal behavior is all but a non-issue, right? They elected a disruptor. It does not matter what kind of mess the bull makes in the china shop. The point is that the china shop must be destroyed. That's a larger conversation, with much more dire implications. I'm going to try and stay on topic right now. Part of the Republican narrative, and this is important, part of the Republican narrative is that the American way of life, again, as white Christians who fantasize that the 50s were awesome, is that the American way of life is under attack from the left, from the progressives. They want to render the country unrecognizable. In a 2019 speech at the University of Notre Dame, current Attorney General William Barr described a world in which he himself is fighting for America's survival against the evil forces of the secularists and their allies among the progressives. Christian, white Christian, Christian values. Amy Coney Barrett, I don't know, she might have been confirmed today, I didn't check. She's the most recent Supreme Court nominee. Like I said, she was going in for confirmation today. In a vote that is, by the way, being boycotted by the Democrats on the committee for all kinds of reasons, is a perfect example of what many conservative religious voters hoped for when they voted for Trump. She is on record as being anti-Roe v. Wade. She is on record as believing that women are subordinate to men. She is on record for all kinds of things that 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, serious people would not have considered, they would have considered them automatic disqualifications for a seat on the highest court in the land. But this is what Trump was elected for, and this is what he is delivering. There are other ways in which the election is being characterized in terms of religion, too. Joe Biden is a Catholic. But the national president of Catholics for Trump recently said this: if you go to church every Sunday, you're voting for Trump. If you go to church twice a year, presumably for Christmas and Easter, you secular Catholics, you're probably going to vote for Biden, right? Again, aligning Christian faith, Christian values with that conservative narrative and that person. And again, that perspective is consistent with the narrative that Christianity and Christian values are under assault from a secular left. In a sort of interesting twist, the vast majority of African American citizens in the U.S. also identify as Christian. And it's at this point that the story gets a little bit more complicated. It also brings us to the next question. We should legitimately ask in this context whether or not race will play a role in this election. Yes. Okay, yes is the answer. The spring 2020 killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, as well as many others, threw light again on widespread American police brutality, as well as on systemic and structural racism that could well play a role in bringing the U.S. to its knees in a variety of ways. The Black Lives Matter protests sharpened the partisan divide even further. You all might have heard the racist counter to that, which is all lives matter. More specific even than that is blue lives matter, referring to the police. It's hard to argue against the idea that whatever Republicans may publicly profess to believe, the clear message that this president has propounded is white is American and not white is un-American. In his book, American Slavery, American Freedom, Edmund S. Morgan argues that the ideal of equality enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution is only made possible by the enslavement of black Africans. The power and influence of colonial-era Caucasian people of European descent were widely varied. They were also not a monolith. Many were incredibly poor, but the one thing they had in common with the landed gentry was at least they weren't black. And so, if you want to make sure that everybody's on board, and you're able to maintain a classist system, you want to make sure that the person on the lowest rung of that ladder has somebody to look down on. Voila. And slavery, therefore, is enshrined as a central tenet of American equality. It's quite an extraordinary argument by Morgan. I wish I had made it. The idea of blackness and the institution of slavery allowed for the mythology of white equality to exist. And the only way to ensure that that distinction remained once the Emancipation Proclamation was enacted was to make sure that black Americans could not vote. Right? Voter intimidation has ebbed and flowed over the course of our history. I am not going to talk about the history of voter intimidation or about Jim Crow laws or Reconstruction or segregation, but I am going to take a quick detour to the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan is a terrorist hate group that was founded as a social club, essentially, with a bunch of mystic doodad, mumbo-jumbo rituals based on the Sons of Malta, another secret sort of organization by a bunch of Confederate officers after the end of the Civil War, 1865. Its revival, and it essentially fizzled out. It did some terrible things over the next 30 years or so, but then fizzled out. Its revival in 1915 was due almost exclusively, as many of you may know, to the wildly popular D.W. Griffith film, Birth of a Nation. In the film, the organization is styled as a protector of virtue, defined as white and Christian, from the forces of evil, blackness, anarchy, and moral turpitude. In the key episode of the film, an amoral, sexually predatory black man, who's actually played by a white man in blackface, naturally, pursues a beautiful, virginal, virtuous young Southern woman up a mountain with the worst possible intentions, possibly murder, but doubtless rape first. She falls to her death, and swift, murderous retribution from the white-hooded, cross-burning cavalry of white Christian virtue is carried out in the form of a ritualistic lynching hooray, and order is restored. President Woodrow Wilson screened this film at the White House and declared it history written with lightning. It was so popular. People loved it. The Anti-Defamation League defined the Proud Boys in this way. While the group can be described as violent, nationalistic, Islamophobic, transphobic, and misogynistic, its members represent a range of ethnic backgrounds, and its leaders vehemently protest any allegations of racism. It's interesting to think about the Proud Boys taking that little piece of progressive politics and saying there's room in our camp for everyone to hate equally. Despite denying that they are a racist group, the Proud Boys tend to espouse racist ideologies and attract white supremacists as members, with founder Gavin McInnes saying, "I love being white, and I think it's something to be very proud of. I don't want our culture diluted. We need to close the borders now and let everyone assimilate to a Western, white, English-speaking way of life." Those of you guys who managed to make it this far in the last presidential debate, if you watched it at all, might have heard the incumbent President Donald Trump say to the Proud Boys, he name-checked them in the middle of the debate and said, "Proud Boys, stand down and stand by," which they took very clearly to mean, stand by, I'll let you know when we need you. I mean, it's this kind of essentially uncoded calling on violent militias to create a disturbance if and when called upon that is giving people who are paying close attention to the historical implications of this election so many sleepless nights. This group also believes that men and Western culture are under siege. It was interesting. I was reading the newspaper today, and the lead article in the New York Times is actually about the striking gender divide in the Latino population in the electorate in the U.S. Latino women prefer Biden to Trump by a whopping 34 percentage points. Latino men prefer Biden to Trump by about 8 percentage points. It's a far smaller margin. Jennifer Medina, writing in the Times, calls it the macho appeal of Donald Trump. What is alienated, she says, this is what Jennifer writes, Ms. Medina. What has alienated so many older female and suburban voters, that is, the behavior of Donald Trump, is a key part of Mr. Trump's appeal to some men. Interviews with dozens of Mexican-American men supporting Mr. Trump show. To them, the macho allure of Mr. Trump is undeniable. He is forceful, wealthy, and most important, unapologetic. This was fascinating to me. In a world where at any moment someone might be attacked for saying the wrong thing, that's true. He says the wrong thing all the time and doesn't bother with self-flagellation. He just says it, and then it goes away. It's incredible. So it's not just about aggrieved white people. It's also about aggrieved men. The gender divide is there as well in all races. White men dramatically prefer, not dramatically, compared to white women. The biggest gap for Trump in terms of polling is suburban, college-educated white women. almost none of them are voting for him, like something almost under 20%. Okay. Some of you guys might remember 2017, Charlottesville, Virginia. It was a rally called Unite the Right. I don't know if it's even legal for me to put that Hakenkreuz flag up there. This is part of an academic lecture, and I am putting it up here to show how absolutely gobsmackingly astounding it is that this is where we have landed. This is where we are. So to recap, white and Christian. In describing the 2017 Charlottesville protests, which pitted white nationalists against liberal racial equity activists, and at which one woman was killed, President Trump said, "There are fine people on both sides." Ladies and gentlemen, fine people on both sides. How did we get here? White racists no longer have to be quiet. That's the message. Trump has said, "I'm giving you a voice and a place in our politics. I am your voice." He won't disavow or condemn white nationalism, white supremacy. He won't do it. Those are supporters. He wants votes. He has no ideology. He is a guy that wants re-election or just love or just attention, in my opinion. His history as a birther, this is the president now, Trump's history as a birther, which is the term that was coined for someone who believed the discredited but nonetheless widely popular idea that President Obama wasn't actually born in the U.S. Sent this message, which was only, again, just barely coded. He's black. Black people don't belong in the White House. Therefore, there must be something fishy going on. Probably a liberal conspiracy. Right? It all tracks. It all goes back to the same thing. Trump went back to this same well of conservative anxiety and popular ideas about the swamp and the deep state. Basically, the idea that career politicians, probably liberals, but certainly people who don't know, understand, or care about you, the electorate, have a stranglehold on the levers of power. His entire presidency can be seen in some ways as a series of attempts to perform disruption. Again, this is where his popularity comes from. People felt alienated. I'll just go off script for a second. This was a story told to me by a guy I know. He's a political operative. He's an attorney in Columbia, South Carolina. And he was talking about the ways in which the liberal and progressive agenda failed to pitch a wide enough tent, economically speaking. And his point, he gave one example, right? He said, imagine that you are an out-of-work coal miner in Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia. You can't afford health care. You can't go to the mountains or the beach for a weekend and haven't for years. There is no chance that you can send your child to college of any sort. And what's happening at the White House? They just legalized gay marriage, and the whole White House is lit up like a rainbow flag. Now, for people who have plenty to eat, great jobs, health care they can count on, and free education, that is something to celebrate. But the progressives, the liberals, the Democratic Party made a serious error. They played to their coastal, uppity constituency of hyper-educated cosmopolitan people. People like me thought that was awesome. Finally, gay marriage is being legalized. Finally, it's about time, right? I have a job. I can send my kids to school. Health insurance is expensive, but I get it through the university that I work for. That is not true for a lot of people. And that is the important thing that people who are still on the left are missing when they get so enraged. Because it's not like all of the people who are voting for Trump are white nationalists or white supremacists. But one of the things that he did was he pitched a big enough economic tent. And even if those people see no economic benefit at all, what they do feel is seen, right? Even hating the same people that I hate makes me feel empowered, right? That is persuasive. And that was helpful for me to hear when my friend told me that story. And he said, listen, I'm voting for Joe Biden, but the Democrats had better get their act together because we cannot run exclusively on the Green New Deal and equity and inclusion. Those are important things, no doubt. But if you don't have health care and you don't have a job, those are the kinds of things that take precedence, potentially. Okay. Back in the game. The Trump narrative is America was once white and Christian, and it should be again. Vote for me, and you will either A, recognize the country and its power structures again, or B, back to the people that I was talking about, if you're white and you never had power, well, you finally will, because I see you, and you're important. Not these people that we are going to gleefully offend. Oh, you know what's terrible is interrupting people. People hate that. Watch this. And he interrupts all the way through, and people love it because they wanted a bull to destroy the China shop. Ultimately, it is all about power. The experience and behavior of many establishment Republicans, like John McCain, Mitch McConnell, and Lindsey Graham, proves that is, since the election, proves that despite their initial outrage in 2015 and 16 at Trump's many transgressions, notably his race-baiting rhetoric, the truth is, ultimately, Republicans did not care how he won, but that he won. It's about power. And don't kid yourself, if the Democrats had won by transgressing, they would be feeling the same way. You have recourse to common standards of decency when you're losing. And when you're winning, you change the rules because it's about power. That's the way that the American political situation is set up. Anyway, speaking of Lindsey Graham, he's the South Carolina incumbent senator. He's been the senator since 2003. Now, here we are in South Carolina. This is the biggest news of the South Carolina election. For the first time since 1998, there is a competitive race between a Republican, Lindsey Graham, and a Democrat, Jamie Harrison. Incredible. What is driving nationwide interest in this race? Well, I'll skip forward one slide so you can see him. That's Jamie Harrison. You'll recall our earlier conversations about race. What's driving the nationwide interest in this race is, in part, the fact that Jamie is an African American. The Black Lives Matter protests have given a lift in visibility and importance to Black American politicians. That's happening. Another is the fact that it is a close race. It becomes newsworthy when it becomes possible for a seat to flip, especially one that's held by someone who has been in Congress long enough and has had as much power and influence as Lindsey Graham. Really, it comes down to the balance of the Senate, however. Many people in the U.S., it looks like between 52 and 56% of them really hate Donald Trump and the policy impacts of his presidency. A 2020 blue wave, which is a huge number of Democrats coming in to the House. The Democrats retain the House. They take the Senate. They take the White House. A blue wave like that puts Democrats potentially in control of all three, the House, the Senate, and the White House, is the best way to make sure that things turn around and turn around quickly. So here is the story. Mr. Harrison is the first black chairman of the South Carolina Democratic Party. He was a Washington lobbyist for a while. He went to undergrad at Yale and then law school at Georgetown. Lindsey Graham shifted from being an intense critic of President Trump to his biggest lapdog. And Democrats are hoping that grassroots energy around defeating Mr. Trump will help some Senate and House candidates score some unlikely victories. Mr. Trump carried South Carolina by 14 percentage points in 2016. It's a huge margin. Okay, so this is the crazy part. In the third quarter of this year, Democratic candidate Jamie Harrison raised over $57 million for his Senate bid to unseat the incumbent. It's hard to overstate how incredible that number is. It is just a huge number. But the key piece of information is that a lot of that money did not come from South Carolina, right? It came from people around the country who saw the race as an opportunity to increase the Democratic advantage in the Senate, right? There's no way that South Carolina Republicans would raise $57 million. I mean, I saw in various corners of social media people from almost every state enthusiastic about giving money to Jamie Harrison. It's just crazy. South Carolina is one of the most reliably red states in the Union, but a Democrat hasn't been elected to Senate there since 2006. Interestingly, if he were to win, he would become South Carolina would become the first state in the Union to be served by two African-American senators. You have Tim Scott, who is currently a senator from South Carolina. Of course, he's a Republican, undermining a lot of the things I said before, nevertheless. Okay. Also, Lindsey is vulnerable. Why? Republicans don't love Lindsey Graham. One, he's gay. Not openly, but pretty much openly. That will not stop Republicans from voting for him, but it could have an impact. He was famously one of the most histrionic members of the Judicial Committee, the Senate Judicial Committee, during Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings. And that was good. He got points for that. People loved that. But Lindsey Graham has never been a real friend to the pro-life, anti-abortion voter or the evangelical voter. He's always been more centrist, national security, business voters, fiscal conservative, country club Republicans, money-based. Those pro-business people do not like the lapdog routine that he's got with Trump now. He's in the process of trying to court these members of Trump's base, the evangelicals, the anti-abortion folks. Maybe he will have some success. I will say the switch from critic to supporter happened with other Republicans as well. Politically connected Republicans that I know in South Carolina told me, many of them repeatedly in 2015 when we were talking about it. I said, what's going on with this guy? He said, he'll never get elected. Don't be ridiculous. There's no way he can win. He's a crazy person and a narcissist. More importantly, he's not a Republican. Again, it's not important how he wins. It's that he wins, right? That's where you get the turn, right? And then you reverse engineer your beliefs and your hopes and dreams so that they match with the winning trajectory. That's just the way that it goes. Now, this is a list of poll results, this thing that you're not seeing up here. What it says is basically that over the last 5 weeks, there have been a lot of polls that have called it, so I'll just read them from the bottom up. Harrison +1, Harrison +1, Harrison +2, even, Graham +1, even, Harrison +2, Graham +6. Graham +6 is the only one of those polls that actually has an A+ rating. Lindsey Graham is going to win. There's almost no doubt. Jamie Harrison is going to overperform. I'm calling it, right? Jamie Harrison is going to outperform expectations, but he's going to fall short. He was, in August and September, almost reliably even and even up a little bit. But what Lindsey successfully did was pinned the reality on him that so much of his money had come from outside of South Carolina. What does that mean? It means that Harrison would be beholden to the national progressive agenda, right? Not a good old boy, not a down-home, good Orangeburg citizen that we all know and understand, but somebody who, because of all the money in his pocket, is going to be a puppet of the radical left. That is how he was characterized, and Jamie could not withstand that characterization, and he has taken a dip in the polls. I still get 6 to 10 emails and texts from him every day telling me that we're so close. I will be delighted to be proved wrong. That's what I think is going to happen. This is a funny graphic. It's right here. It says Trump is favored to win in South Carolina. And this Nate Silver is a famous statistician. He famously called the election for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Got it wrong. But so what they do is they have this super elaborate model, and they model the election results 40,000 times. And then they plot them on a graph, right? And this says 89 and 100 times Trump wins, and 11 and 100 Biden wins. And really, it's because of the enthusiasm for Trump that Harrison is going to lose, because people will just vote a straight ticket. It's a possibility in South Carolina. You can say straight party. You can push that button, and it votes for all the Republicans. If that were not the case, he might have a chance. Basically, what I want to say is even though South Carolinians may no longer be in love with Lindsey Graham, they are still in love with Trump. And we're coming to the end here. 2 days ago, Jason Riley wrote an article called "Lighting Will Have to Strike Twice for Trump to Win." The picture is still different nationally, regardless of what it looks like in South Carolina. In 2016, Hillary Clinton was leading by 6.8 points in the national polls and lost. In 2008, Barack Obama was leading by a nearly identical 6.9 points and won. Republicans, like those in South Carolina, expect this year to be a repeat of 2016. They have to. They have to think that. In 2016, surveys underestimated Mr. Trump's support in swing states. A repeat of 2016 would require widespread polling errors that once again all lean Republican. That is possible, but it is not likely, especially since all the pollsters and the statisticians were burned at the stake after the 2016 election. You promised, and it didn't happen. Joe Biden has led the current race for months. The Real Clear Politics polling average currently, as of today, puts him up 8.6 percentage points ahead nationally. The latest Wall Street Journal poll has him up by 11, and the most recent Fox News poll has him leading by 10. Fox News leading by 10. More significantly, Mr. Biden is ahead in the battleground states that are expected to decide the race. This is Mr. Riley's analysis, okay? He's ahead in the battleground states, including states that Trump won in 2016, Arizona, Michigan, North Carolina, and Wisconsin. Biden is up in those states. Mr. Trump is underperforming with seniors and suburban women, which is one reason Republicans lost control of the House 2 years ago. The biggest problem that Trump has with Joe Biden, according to Mr. Riley, is that Joe isn't Hillary. It's hard to argue with how Democrats have played their hand in 2020. Mr. Trump wanted to run against a divisive leftist firebrand like Ocasio-Cortez, the lady who haunts the dreams of conservatives at night. Instead, he found himself facing an amiable journeyman who was best known for his pragmatism and his ability to play well with others. Nevertheless, Mr. Trump has spent the campaign trying to redefine his opponent, which has left him less time to make his own case. All right, so again, this is the, let's see, we might be able to get this. Okay, so this is the current, I found this and checked it again an hour before I came to talk to you guys here, okay? This is Nate Silver's 40,000 models result. 12 and 100, Trump wins. 88 and 100, Biden wins. Almost the same as it was the other way around in South Carolina. Okay. So, to be honest, I feel surprisingly confident that Biden will or would ultimately win both the popular vote and the Electoral College this year. But because of the vagaries of the election process, there are a lot of unanswered questions. The biggest issue, not the biggest, one big issue is that Republicans, for whatever reason, tend to show up in larger numbers on the actual voting day, on November 3rd, whereas Democrats tend to favor, again, who knows why, mail-in or absentee ballots or early voting. The polls are starting to tighten slightly. The debates tonight could have further consequences. One possibility is that because of that particular turnout permutation, more Republicans out on November 3rd, but more total ultimate Democratic ballots cast, what it could show is that by midnight on the 3rd is a Trump win. That's possible, especially since there are rules that have a lot to do, there are rules in lots of states that say you can't start counting your absentee ballots until Election Day. Well, votes cast on Election Day are electronically tallied. Other kinds of votes, mail-in votes, have to be counted by hand. It's much more laborious. It takes a much longer time. If that happens, that is, Trump is able to declare victory on November 3rd, he has all sorts of levers of power that he can press to prevent the mail-in ballots from being counted in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina. I'm trying to be positive, but even my idealism and optimism, which, to be honest, are quite American and intense, are having difficulty withstanding the onslaught of these past 4 years and the implications of what could happen on and after November 3rd. I am, at the request of Dr. Hochbruch, on November 5th, going to sit on a panel. It'll be 2 days after the election. So I will happily give you my thoughts on everything that's happened from then until or from now at least, until the 5th at that time. But at this moment, I will just say thank you for your attention and engagement, and if you're anything like me, you will hope for a landslide. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions. Anything you guys want to ask about or talk about? Professor Hochbruch was abducted by aliens.